right, Nicola, welcome to Cassandra.
Thank you for the invitation, Armin.
Nicola, you looked at EU-China relations, the monetary, the financial side for a long time. Before we go into the topic, into the background, where all of this is heading, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Well, thank you, Armin. Well, I was probably one of the first PhD students to terminate a doctoral thesis on Europe and China relations almost 20 years ago, which means that my interest in the bilateral relationship between Europe and China goes back to the early 2000s. Now, I started to look into the technological and security elements of the relationship and their implications that these security ties would have for the United States and East Asia. But pretty soon also moved into the new areas of monetary and financial issues, as you mentioned, in particular because at a certain point during the eurozone crisis, a decade ago, if you remember, when the eurozone was under speculative attacks, coming in particular from hedge funds and big banks headquartered in Wall Street and also partially in the city. During the eurozone, China would intervene both politically and financially to sustain the eurozone. So at that time, I started to devote more attention and do research on this unique and new axis in monetary affairs between Europe and China, which of course had the common objective to lessen the reliance on the US dollar. So that's the reason.
And if you think about, obviously there's a lot of talk nowadays on the de-dollarization, topic. It's pretty hot, and some people argue, well, it's not going to happen or not anytime soon. It just, some people argue, and you said before we started this, well, it's not only is it already happening, but from a historical perspective. The European Union as well as China are obviously very much incentivized and have all, taken actions in the past and might, take actions in the future. So, can you give us a little bit of, a wrap up, where are we coming from this issue? And then, what are really the incentives, why it's important to both sides, whatever all sorts of politicians are saying?
Yes, absolutely. But just to give you a number for those that listen about the de-dollarization, until a couple of years ago, the latest data by the IMF indicated that the US dollar was around 55-56% of the global reserves. Now, latest data indicated that the dollar has gone below 50%, which means it dropped around 6-7% over the last year. Very much when the war again in Ukraine started and Western sanctions were applied against Russia. So the numbers already indicate that we are entering into a process, a phase of de-dollarization. Now the question is, why would and should the Europeans and the Chinese be interested in supporting this trend towards de-dollarization? We have to distinguish the two actors. China does it in order to challenge the predominant position of the United States in the world, and of course, the internationalization of the Chinese currency challenges the dollar, which is the ultimate symbol of American power in the world. For the Europeans, is different because the Europeans are loyal allies of the United States. But the challenge that they have against the dollar has more to do with the willingness and the desire by the Europeans to lessen the reliance on, for instance, the Federal Reserve, which means it will allow the Europeans to be less reliant on America's economic cycle. But also, in the case of the Europeans, more than challenging the dominant position of the United States, is more about gaining independence when it comes to pursue independent economic policies and foreign policy. An example, when the Europeans were trying to negotiate and salvage the Iran's nuclear dossier if you remember some years ago, the Europeans with the Russians, the Chinese,
right,
and to some extent the Americans tried to find a deal with Iran on developing civilian nuclear capabilities. Now, the Trump administration walked away from the accord called the JPO, so the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, leaving the Europeans to decide what to do. One of the terms was that Iran had to be helped financially, economically, in order to comply with the accords. The issue of sanctions became important. The Trump administration imposed sanctions on any company entity that would trade with Iran. At that point, the Europeans that would still rely quite a lot on the dollar could not save the Iran deal. Had Europe or the financial system be more used to using euros, then the history could have been different. In other words, I'm saying that for the European Union, in particular the eurozone, the members that have of the EU that have accepted to use the European common currency, using its own common currency in global trade, in financial transactions, would also support their foreign policy. And therefore, the de-dollarization elements inside Europe have much less to do with the weakening of America's promise in the world, much more to do with their desire to emerge as a global power. So Europe is a global power and use the euro as an instrument of foreign policy. And this is important to underline because whereas in the case of China, the challenge is not only financial, but also more geopolitical and much larger. In the case of the Europeans, is really limited to the idea to have the euro as a tool for foreign policy. And of course, lessening the reliance on the dollar would help this development. So, but the other aspect which needs to be understood is that both Europe and China, even if they come from different positions when it comes to create a world where the dollar would be less predominant, even if they come from different positions, they have common interest when it comes to create a multipolar monetary system. How have they done it? Well, first of all, I mentioned before that during the Eurozone crisis, we had the intervention of China to support the Eurozone. That was not new because when in 1999, the euro, the European common currency, was launched, China almost immediately said that it was a very good and welcome development in world politics, right, because China immediately saw in the emergence of the euro as the potential of creating a multipolar currency system. So already from the beginning, China has supported the Eurozone for strategic reasons. During the Eurozone crisis, in particular in 2012, 2013, when speculative attacks were made against Eurozone members, China would intervene politically by issuing statements in favor of buying Eurozone bonds, even if it was just statements, so we don't know what they made. There have been indications from people, both within the IMF and national governments that I had the pleasure to meet and interview, that in reality, actually China intervened in the financial markets, and that China would invest sums to sustain the Eurozone and the parity between the renminbi and the euro. Why? Again, strategic reasons.
Yeah, sure.
The idea to have Eurozone that would also challenge the dollar, but also for economic reasons. By keeping up the value of the euro, China would lower the value of the renminbi. Hence, Chinese exports in Europe would be cheaper. So that would also help China's trade balance. So you do have these two drivers, strategic reasons, but also basic national interest. Now, at the same time, after the Eurozone crisis, we also had another interesting development, and in this case, from the side of the Europeans. In July 2015, the Chinese currency, the renminbi, was included for the first time in the special drawing rights of the International Monetary Fund. Mm-hmm. What are these special drawing rights? It is essentially a global reserve currency managed by the IMF, which is a basket which includes 5 currencies. Until July 2015, the currencies were 4: the US dollar, the euro, the British pound, and the Japanese yen. After July 2015, the inclusion had the renminbi also. So the basket now has these 5 currencies. Mm-hmm. That was a major decision by the IMF. Why? Because the RMB, the renminbi, unlike the other 4 currencies, is not a convertible currency and does not yet the criteria for reserve status. In other words, as in many other cases where China has surprised the world and challenges our logic, right, because China does certain things and we think it should be different, also in the monetary field is happening the same. The Chinese currency, the RMB, has become a reserve currency for the IMF and many other central banks, even if the RMB does not meet the reserve status criteria. That's quite challenging for our mind. Why it doesn't meet the reserve status criteria? Again, as I mentioned before, it is not yet convertible. The Chinese central bank is not fully independent from the political power. The Chinese Communist Party still controls what the central bank does, and also the extent of the capital markets in China is not as deep and free as it would require to have a reserve status criteria. So for different reasons that economists and monetary experts know very well, the renminbi, the Chinese currency, is offering us this intellectual conundrum. It has become, by fact, a reserve currency, yet it does not meet the criteria for reserve currency. Now, why then the IMF decided to include such a currency in the basket of the special drawing rights? But mainly because of the Europeans. In July 2015, the debate in the West, in particular in Washington, was that the Chinese currency should not be included in the IMF basket, because, again, it did not meet the criteria for reserve status. The Europeans, on the contrary, although recognizing this, decided to support unanimously the inclusion of the renminbi in the IMF reserves. That was a major split within the Western alliance, and it was a political split. The Europeans knew very well what the Americans knew, that the Chinese currency did not meet the criteria I explained before, yet they supported the inclusion with the Chinese currency. Why? A political decision, probably taken to recompensate, to thank you what China had done previously in support of the eurozone. Now, in July 2022, last year, again, a similar thing happened. The IMF had to review its basket of currencies, and they decided to increase the share of the renminbi inside the basket, which means that the Chinese currency now has more weight inside the special drawing rights managed by the International Monetary Fund. Guess who was in favor of such an enlargement of the weight of the renminbi? The Europeans. Who was a bit more skeptical about that? The Americans. So now we have here 2 examples of how the Europeans and the Chinese, for different reasons, coming from different sides and different visions about world order and their relationship with the United States, coming from two different sides, they have come together to support each other monetary ambitions and eventually challenge the predominant role of the dollar in the global economy. I mentioned the Chinese support during the eurozone crisis. I also mentioned how the Europeans supported the inclusion of the RMB in the IMF, and even it's a bigger weight of the RMB.
Right. I mean, for me, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like, okay, so you have from the security side, you have probably more, okay, you have the China, Russia, there's like common interest, versus the US. And here it's kind of similar with the EU and China, right? I mean, maybe we can see it that way. But obviously, like for, going forward, there is this kind of issue that, yes, you have this common interest of de-dollarize. Okay, the euro is playing a bigger role, the RMB is playing a bigger role, and the IMF, obviously, is always a signal function for other central banks, right, that then hold the reserves. But like, how do we kind of, going forward, or like what's maybe like already, or what's discussed now, like what do you think, do you see these things continue now that we are in this kind of recalibrating the relations with the EU China? When we record this, Macron and Ursula von der Leyen have just gone to Beijing and then caused all sorts of stir. So there's a lot of stuff going on. So how do you see this? Like, do you see what are current initiatives, and what would be maybe like, take us into the future? What do you think is gonna, what is gonna happen? Is this cooperation kind of continue as in the past, or like, more or less?
Okay, yes, it is not actually a cooperation which is an established one, right, or a coordination, but it will continue, it will increase. I'll give an example. Yes, the visit of von der Leyen and Macron in China, which has attracted quite a lot of attention, was pretty critical towards China, regardless of Macron's statements that were a bit different. The position of the European Union vis-à-vis China is quite critical and firm when it comes to some issues. However, something that many people have overlooked is what happened a few days before Macron and von der Leyen went to China, and which I reported in a short piece that I published on the website of the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. A few days before the French president went to China, French company Total Energies and China National Offshore Oil Corporation completed the first purchase of imported liquefied natural gas to be settled in Chinese RMB.
Interesting.
What does it mean? It means that for the first time, a major European company, well, by chance French in that case, just a few days before Macron went to China, decided to use the Chinese currency to buy liquefied natural gas. It's small. It's just something that in the order of magnitude of exchanges between the two sides is really small. However, it gives an indication of where the trend might be. It is something that it was not discussed too much. I think Macron wanted to stay away from touching the issue of multipolar currency order or de-dollarization.
Sure.
Also because he made already some remarks that attracted the attention and the concern of the allies. So probably he didn't want to go too much into that direction. But what it is happening is the private sector in Europe is using more and more the Chinese currency. I gave you the example of Total Energies, but European banks are those at the forefront when it comes to the use of the Chinese currency. The Chinese created a few years ago this China Interbank Payment System, CHIPS, which is alternative to the Western-dominated SWIFT. If you recall, last year, when after Russia invaded Ukraine, the Western allies kicked off Russia from SWIFT, which meant that Russia was unable to process its international payments using this network, which is the biggest one, because since it is dominated by the Western nations, they decided to kick Russia out. Now, Russia has then, and since then, used alternative methods of payment, including, and more importantly, the Chinese one, the China Interbank Payment System. Now, the fact that European banks are those that are they have the highest number in the chips, which means that the chips is an alternative network of banks, the majority of which are Chinese. But outside China, the highest number of these banks is in Europe, which means that European banks are essentially supporting a wider use of the renminbi for international transactions. But another example, across Europe now, there have been since like in the last decade, a lot of renminbi hubs, places where you can exchange the renminbi. They are in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Milan. That's already an indication of the growing use of the renminbi in Europe. On top of that, some important stock exchanges, London, Paris, Frankfurt, Milan, they have created connection mechanisms with the stock exchange in Shanghai, again, promoting financial links and often using the Chinese currency. In other words, I'm observing the current trend. On the one hand, EU-China relations are worsening, and it gives the idea sometimes to a superficial observation that it is more and more limited, the number of areas where the cooperation happens. In reality, not only the cooperation areas is not shrinking, but there are some areas which are not studied enough, like the monetary and financial areas, which are instead growing. So we have tensions in Europe-China relations, but the reality is different. And Europeans and Chinese so far are increasing their level of cooperation on many issues. Going forward, I would expect Europe to play an important role in the internationalization of the renminbi. Already, European banks, as I mentioned before, are increasingly using the renminbi. Right. And I would expect that to grow. Also because the Chinese currency is used more and more by other important actors, not only Russia, but we saw in the last weeks Saudi Arabia willing to price the oil that it sells to China using the Chinese currency, but also Brazil, for instance. So the trend is towards a growing use of the Chinese currency, which could also be used politically by the Chinese leadership in order to support further the eurozone in case the eurozone meets again another crisis. All of that indicates that the trend towards de-dollarization will continue, that China is not the only actor active on this trend towards de-dollarization, that also the Europeans are contributing, and that by observing what the Europeans and the Chinese are doing vis-a-vis each other, we may get a better view of what will be the future of the monetary order in the next years.
So obviously these, very important trend seems to continue, it's kind of steady. Do you see any particular initiatives that are discussed right now, or any interesting signals, or do you have any kind of outlook in particular areas, like how it's gonna continue? Or do you think, okay, yes, here and there we might have some other kind of companies now that they are, like Total, like you mentioned, is there any kind of thing, any hypothesis that you have? on that?
Yeah, I think the use by companies and banks would be a good indication. But what could become a changer, a hypothesis, is when it comes, for instance, to big issues that involve a lot of money. And here in mind, I have the reconstruction of Ukraine post-conflict. At a certain point, in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, there will be a ceasefire, or in any case, a kind of settlement in Ukraine. And Ukraine needs to be reconstructed. And there will be a lot of money. The Europeans may not be able to provide the money necessary to reconstruct fully Ukraine. And outside intervention is needed. We don't know whether the Americans will also be able and willing to invest as much as they have been investing now. We should expect outside actors, outside Europe, actors such as China, to have a role, not only in the political settlement, but even more so in the post-reconstruction. I would expect, but that's my hypothesis, the Chinese becoming with the Europeans the biggest investors. We're talking here about hundreds of billions, a lot of money that could really change and could really involve some such big sums that really countries or states with deep pockets may be able to do. At that point, there could be the creation, at least in some parts of the world, of really a kind of trilateral monetary system. I would expect in the Middle East, in parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, other parts, the Chinese RMB to be used widely along with the euro and the US dollar. At that point, we will enter into another era of tripolarity, probably localized. I don't think that it will be global, but once you have important sums of money injected, and if the Chinese intervene with important sums of money, as I would expect, that could be the case. So this could be a game changer. And I think that we are not yet ready in the West, not only in Europe, but in the West, to have a situation whereby China becomes present, not only when it comes to trade, but also in financial issues. We have seen it in the past with the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of loans, also that had some problems. The case, the issue with China is a bit more complicated by the fact that the system is opaque, is not transparent, and not being a democracy means that there are less check and balances as you would have in the West. However, Chinese sums are likely to increase in the future. My hypothesis is in the case of Ukraine, there will be huge sums of money from China, also because Ukraine used to be very important for the Belt and Road Initiative, China's initiative connecting Asia to Europe. So there will be an incentive by the Chinese to intervene. Then we will have to face this new world whereby how to coordinate this intervention, this reconstruction of Ukraine with the Chinese that have a different mindset and different rules. It will be a challenge, but we may not have other choices in the West, given the sums required. But this is a hypothesis. I may be wrong. It might be completely different. But my gut feeling is that we need to get ready to that.
So Nicola, when you just said that, well, it's still a hypothesis. So let's talk a little bit like, are there any signals that you see going forward, let's say over the next 12 months, right? Let's stick more or less short term, that might confirm or disconfirm this hypothesis?
Yes. Let's look now how many banks, European banks, are connected to this China interbank payment system. Let's check in 12 months how many banks will be connected to this China interbank payment system. Not only the number of banks, the amount of sums transacted. We can also see in 12 months how many European companies may have done what Total Energies did a few weeks ago. So we do have some indications, but we also have the other side that can give us some indications. Let's look at how many sums will be pledged by China for the reconstruction of Ukraine. At a certain point in the next months, we may start this conversation, at least in the West. And that would be interesting to see how China moves in what direction. So we can have, in terms of observation, a few indicators that can tell us whether we're moving this direction. Some from Europe, others from China. But numbers cannot be wrong. I can be wrong in 12 months. I could be right if these indicators are on the rise. But what it is important to underline is that we are really entering into a new world whereby the old assumptions are not valid anymore. Who could have thought only a few years ago that China would propose a 12-point peace plan for Ukraine, even if it was not sufficient for the West, because it is still perceived to be
it's the buffer state idea, right?
Towards Russia. And who could have thought that China could have and will have a role in the reconstruction of Ukraine once the arms, if not come to an end, at least once a ceasefire or some political settlement will be found.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And if I wrap it up, is there any kind of index or kind of how to track these numbers? Because I imagine Total deal, is that announced, or do you know of any of these data sources? And we link them in the show notes.
It was announced. It was like many things nowadays. It seems that sometimes mainstream media is quite doesn't give us what we need to know on certain developments in the world. So it was announced, it was, and you can find it also on their website, but it was, it was found in other kind of outlets. I think only Bloomberg had a few lines, but most of the newspapers and TVs didn't mention it, probably because they thought it was not important. Right. But again, sometimes the important things are those that, especially if they're emerging, are those that are not very flashy at the beginning and have to be followed. Now, this is one of the issues here, that you have to track these numbers, like in the case of the China interbank payment system on their website and try to see how many banks. Sometimes what I did in the past also check if some European banks were actually part of the system, to what extent, etc. Now, there's also another indicator, which is the use of the special drawing rights of the IMF that I mentioned before. Again, in the case of the reconstruction of a country like Ukraine, the IMF will be asked to intervene quite substantially. Now, another indicator would be to observe the kind of discussions that the five entities, because in the case of the eurozone, you have more a political entity. Sure. The Japan, the UK, United States, the eurozone, and China, the kind of discussions that they would have when it comes to the amount of special drawing rights to issue to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine. That would be also a very interesting indicator, because then countries will pledge their a certain amount of money to be channeled for the IMF for the reconstruction. So Chinese money may not go directly to Ukraine, might be channeled probably more likely channeled for the IMF. The substance doesn't change, it's only the channel that changes, which means that this is another indicator to track what happens in China in some areas, what happens in Europe in some areas, and what happens inside the IMF when it comes to the use of special drawing rights that will be used, very likely, in the reconstruction of Ukraine post-conflict.
It's very interesting. It's counterintuitive. The media, the mainstream media does, I see it on many, I think we see it on many areas where there is this kind of selective attention bias for sure. So, Nicola, before we wrap this up, where can people follow your work?
Oh, they can follow my work mainly on the internet. I decided some years ago not to be active on Facebook or Twitter. I only have a LinkedIn account, but I try to publish as much as possible on articles, op-eds, commentaries.
Right.
So it's quite easy to follow me. Just Google my name and things should be easily come up.
Nicola, I learned a lot. Thank you so much for making the time and, talk soon.
Thank you to you.